With respect to Spain, I think they heard the president's message yesterday loud and clear. And it's my understanding over the past several hours, they've agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military.
That was easy.
So let's check in again on this rogue handful of our so-called NATO allies that have been trying to stage an international No Kings protest by opposing Trump, opposing the war in Iran, because to make a long story short, they have rapidly found out, and we already have these nations and their leftist world leaders caving and now agreeing to cooperate with the United States. It's really funny about how that works, because a couple of days ago, we explained that what's happening right now is America is making its geopolitical chess move for the 21st century. Lines are being drawn across the sand, and the countries, especially the countries in the West, in NATO, in America's sphere of influence, who pick the wrong side of this conflict are going to seriously regret it. They're making a grave mistake. Now, it was worth noting that despite maybe Iran's hopes that they would get a bunch of America's alliances to break apart, the opposite has happened. Actually, the vast majority of NATO countries have been heavily supportive of the United States. That even includes some with liberal leadership in charge. The Muslim Gulf states, which were a variable in this conflict, are now actively joining the hot war against Iran. But we did have individual countries like Spain who decided to do the opposite and make a really dumb move. Spain, we explained, is a country that is currently being run by a radical communist by the name of Pedro Sanchez, who decided to do this whole thing about how, oh, I'm against the war in Iran. I support the Islamic invaders who are taking over my country. This violates international law, blah, 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 and went on to ban the United States from using military bases in Spanish territory for those operations, which, by the way, we sort of own those bases jointly. So essentially what he did as a NATO ally, right, was kick America out of his country. Well, in the days since, Trump, of course, threatened to cut off trade negotiations. Pedro Sanchez decided to be a tough guy. No, you can't do that. We're still against the war. But now, quietly, as of today, folks, it's being announced that actually the government of Spain has agreed to work with the United States. It's really funny how that always happens. But at the same time, we have to also acknowledge the country of Canada. Of course, this is the most infamous one, right? Led by Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney, who initially, believe it or not, came out in relative support of U.S. operations in the Middle East. And then because Mark Carney is always looking for any attempt to undermine Trump, attack the United States, side with China, his BFF, and just, break apart the world order that he claims we're breaking apart, okay? So after watching that Pedro Sanchez had done something against the United States, we saw Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney do a complete about-face and then start condemning America for what they're doing in Iran and complaining, by the way, that America didn't tell us beforehand. This is the same guy who's saying he wants to work with China, he wants to break apart the world order, the age of working with America is done, and is now fuming at America that we didn't ask the Canadians for permission beforehand in Iran. A very stupid performance, but once again, Canada's doing this thing where they think the other countries are going to join in because, hey, everybody hates Trump, right? Everyone's just as Trump deranged as us. And then now that Spain is sort of leaving the anti-Trump rebellion, here you have this fool, this idiot Mark Carney once again, completely isolating himself. And now, given the fact that Turkey is even involved as of today, going down, guys, Canada, as basically the only NATO nation left that is isolated and opposing and trying to go against the United States right now. So again, not a very good time to be one of these anti-Trump leftists if you're running a Western country. It would be best to kind of keep your head down and shut up. But every time one of these moles is popping their heads out from the sand to say, no kings, it turns out it's not going very well for them. So that said, let's get into this full story here today. Again, we'll tell you about the NATO countries that tried to go against Trump and what has happened ever since. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We greatly appreciate the support, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And that said, just to briefly recap our prior video, we spoke about, what Spain was up to. Of course, President Trump recently, in a White House meeting with the Chancellor of Germany, threatened to cut off Spain's all trade negotiations with the country of Spain if they didn't start getting on board for their rampant delinquency in payments to NATO, as well as obviously this current performative stunt where they're trying to kick the U.S. military out of their country. Take a listen.
Everybody was enthusiastic about it, Germany, everybody, and Spain didn't do it. And now Spain actually said that we can't use their bases, and that's all right. We could use their base if we want. We could just fly in and use it. Nobody's going to tell us not to use it, but we don't have to. But they were unfriendly, and so I told him we don't want to. Spain has absolutely nothing that we need other than great people. They have great people, but they don't have great leadership. And as you know, they were the only country that in NATO would not agree to go up to 5%. I don't think they would have agreed to go up to anything. They wanted to keep it at 2%, and they don't pay the 2%. So we're going to cut off all trade with Spain. We don't want anything to do with Spain.
Yeah, and so basically the threat that Trump was making was to say, at a time when other NATO and EU nations are having relatively good cooperation with the United States, at a time when most of the region is coalescing against Iran and understanding what moment this is, and hey, you don't want to get left behind, you don't want to be isolated by the changing nature of the geopolitical order, right? That it's ridiculous for a country like Spain that is already a lazy delinquent, that doesn't pay into NATO, is basically mooching off of everyone else's defense, to do something as ridiculous as to say, no U.S. military as a fellow NATO ally. We're just going to condemn you, and you cannot use our military bases, even though most other European nations are, of course, saying yes to that. Now, in their initial response, the Spanish government, led by radical communist Pedro Sanchez, tried to double down, right? They were defiant against Trump. They were saying, no, we're serious. We don't support the war in Iran. You saw Pedro Sanchez try to use the excuse that, well, they can't cut off trade with us because we're a part of the EU, and so it's a bilateral trade agreement, blah, blah, blah. But we'll show you in a second how this didn't really last all too long. But first, take a listen to what Pedro Sanchez said as of just a few hours ago, continuing to sound like a Democrat speaking about the Iran conflict.
We must learn from history and cannot play Russian roulette with the fate of millions of people. The powers involved in this conflict must immediately cease hostilities and commit to dialogue and diplomacy. And the rest of us must act consistently, defending now the same values that we defend when we talk about Ukraine, Gaza, Venezuela or Greenland. Because the question is not whether or not we are in favor of the Ayatollahs. No one is. Certainly not the Spanish people, and of course not the Spanish government either. The question, rather, is whether or not we are on the side of international law, and therefore of peace. Governments are here to improve people's lives, to provide solutions to problems, not to make people's lives worse. And it is absolutely unacceptable that those leaders who are incapable of fulfilling that mission use the smoke of war to hide their failure, and incidentally to fill up the pockets of a few, of the usual ones, the only ones who win when the world stops building hospitals to build missiles.
Now, bear in mind, the same fool saying that we cannot play Russian roulette with millions of people is quite literally playing Russian roulette with millions of people who show up to his borders. This is the same guy who's giving mass amnesty to, now it turns out, about 1.2 million Pakistani migrants. Before that number was announced to be 500,000, now it's looking like they're increasing it. Of course, he likewise tries to accuse the billionaires and the elites of lining their pockets and desperately trying to distract everybody with war, as of course he is quite literally trying to buy a brand new voter base because he's growing highly unpopular in his country due to failed governance and massive scandals of corruption, by the way, specifically tied to what your government was doing with laundering money back and forth between the Venezuelan government. But I'm sure, guys, the reason why Pedro Sanchez has been so opposed to all the recent U.S. military actions has nothing to do with that, right? He just cares a lot about sovereignty. He cares a lot about the sovereignty of Iran's borders, right? Not his own, but other countries' borders outside of his own. That's perfectly fine. But when millions of people invade his own country, obviously, that's actually a good thing. So, but anyways, there you have it, right? That was the initial statement of defiance. Now, I do want to now show you what Mark Carney initially came out and said about Iran the day that all the fighting broke out, because he sort of made it sound like he's on our side, right? So he says the Canadian government is closely following Iran-related hostilities throughout the Middle East and urges all Canadians to shelter in place. Canada's position remains clear. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East, one of the world's worst human rights records, and must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. Oh, that sounds like they're kind of in support of us, right? Canada and our international partners have consistently called upon the Iranian regime to end its nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. Despite diplomatic efforts, Iran has never fully dismantled. Wow, Mark Carney sounds a lot like Trump here. So what does he finally go on here to state? Canada supports the United States. That could not be more clear, right? Again, this is on February 28th. Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. So that could not be any more explicit. Mark Carney says, America, in this case, we're on your side despite recent differences. But magically, in the last couple of days, as a matter of fact, I believe this was only last night, Mark Carney suddenly comes out and totally flips sides. Now, why could that be the case? I would argue it's two reasons. Number one, because he realizes he's imported a very, we'll say, extremist voter base within his country that likely is very unhappy with his position. So he's trying to, appease the radicals who support him, number one. But then secondly, kind of like he did with China on Liberation Day, I think Mark Carney thought that, oh, wait a minute, everyone's going against America. We're going to join in with Spain. So that's why just days later, in a magical about face, after explicitly saying he supports the United States, he's now sitting here and complaining that the United States and Israel acted without engaging the United Nations or consulting their allies, including Canada, essentially fuming that Canada was not included after explicitly stating at, the Munich Security Conference and World Economic Forum and others that he doesn't want Canada to be included, but now he's very upset about that. Take a listen.
We support efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. Because Canada is taking the world as it is, not passively waiting for a world we wish to be. We do, however, take this position with regret because the current conflict is another example of the failure of the international order. Despite decades of UN Security Council resolutions, the tireless work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the succession of sanctions and diplomatic frameworks, Iran's nuclear threat remains. And now, the United States and Israel have acted without engaging the United Nations or consulting allies, including Canada. So where to from here? With a rapidly spreading conflict and growing threats to civilian life. Canada reaffirms that international law binds all belligerents. We condemn the strikes carried out by Iran on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the Middle East. And we implore all parties, including the United States and Israel, to respect the rules of international engagement. Canada calls for a rapid de-escalation of hostilities and is prepared to assist in achieving this goal.
Yeah, so we went from Canada supports the United States to sounding a lot like Pedro Sanchez and saying, oh, international law, we should de-escalate. They didn't ask Canada for permission first. Yeah, gee, I wonder why. I wonder why the country who is basically publicly saying we're no longer an ally of the United States, the country who is openly and transparently, they're not hiding it, right? Selling themselves out to China in order to attempt to spite Trump and the United States, which I'm sure is such a smart idea, by the way. It totally just won't go wrong at all whatsoever. Why you were not consulted beforehand for your permission or your wise guidance on how to conduct foreign policy. But here we go again, where Carney seems to think that, oh, we're going to lead this uprising. We're going to make this grandstand against the United States, and we're going to have friends and allies. Because Carney has seemed to believe, oh, the Europeans are tired of Trump. Other powers in NATO are feeling the same way. They're going to take my side. And then inevitably, what's been happening over Greenland, over everything in recent months, is that that nobody is actually taking Canada's side. In the end, most of everyone else is siding with the United States, and Canada, of course, is just leaving themselves isolated, which I will repeat is not a good decision for them. But in this case, maybe Carney is thinking to himself, well, we still have Spain. At least the radical communist in Spain is going to, be our friend in this situation. Except it turns out that's no longer the case. Okay, it only took about 48 hours. But following President Trump's threat to ban all trade with Spain, Karoline Leavitt today announced at 1:35 p.m. Eastern Time in the press conference that indeed Spain had already bent the knee. Take a listen.
So, because Spain is a member of the EU, does that at all put a wrinkle in the president's plan for a trade embargo with them? With respect to Spain, I think they heard the president's message yesterday loud and clear. And it's my understanding over the past several hours they've agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military. And so I know that the U.S. military is coordinating with their counterparts in Spain. But the president expects all of our European allies, of course, to cooperate in this long sought after mission, not just for the United States, but also for Europe, to crush the rogue Iranian regime that, again, not only threatens America, but also threatens our European allies as well.
I mean, it's really just too easy. I have no idea why they even try. But essentially what happened here is that Spain tried to challenge the United States. They then realized it was not that good of an idea, not just because they were challenging the United States, but even their appeals to other EU countries were largely ignored because the other European countries that maybe Spain has an even closer relationship with, likewise, are saying to Spain, what the heck are you doing? And Trump even managed to turn Germany against Spain and also saying, you guys aren't spending money on defense either, right? You're just mooching off of us. So now all these other European countries are feeling the same way. And in the end, Pedro Sanchez realized, I guess, that it's just not a good position for him to be taking. He might as well keep his head down, shut up, and stop trying to engage in, Trump derangement syndrome and political stunts, which once again leaves the one and only Mark Carney of Canada completely isolated. He's all by himself. The rest of NATO is sitting around the cool kids table. He's by himself alone at the lunch table saying, hey, anyone want to sit with me? Xi Jinping, you want to sit with me? And just a total disgrace for him. But, what do we expect? He should have just stayed in the same lane he was, but obviously not. And as I said, right, the countries right now who make the wrong geopolitical chess moves, when everyone in the relevant spheres of influence are trending towards the United States, well, you're going to be pretty alone. And the same is true now of the country of Turkey. This is another NATO power that, one could question, do they really belong in NATO or not? Does Spain belong in NATO? Does Canada belong in NATO? Is NATO even still relevant? These are all good questions to be asked, but that's irrelevant to this conversation. Right now, Turkey, thus far, has been another neutral state, right? Much like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states before the whole conflict started, they didn't want to get involved. They sort of have these sympathies that might swing towards both sides. Except what happened today, ladies and gentlemen, is that Iran, once again, just like they did to the Gulf states, has now launched missiles at Turkey, which has made the neutral NATO nation of Turkey now incredibly pissed off, and even they're vowing to potentially retaliate and get involved in the war as well.
This is breaking news. Turkey's Ministry of Defense says that an Iranian ballistic missile was launched toward their country, and it was shot down by NATO air defense systems, fragments of that missile landing in southern Turkey. This is a major development and the first time that a country like Turkey has received incoming Iranian ballistic missile fire.
Yeah, so factually speaking, all that Iran managed to do was strengthen many of America's alliances, right? A lot of NATO started to get together over this. The Gulf states now together. Now even Turkey vowing potential retaliation against Iran because they're looking here saying, what the heck did we have to do with any of this? And so yes, the whole world is turned against Iran. Russia and China are refusing to come to their defense. They are completely isolated. They're completely alone, which really makes you ask the question, what on earth would someone like previously Pedro Sanchez or now currently Mark Carney even be thinking, right? Why are you trying to get on obviously what's going to be the losing side of this conflict? But as I said, right, this is what Trump derangement syndrome does to a person like Mark Carney. He is willing to not only sell his country to China, but now also even take the wrong side in geopolitics and foreign conflicts and those types of affairs just because, well, you know, even if Canada ends up completely looking stupid and America's never going to forget this and all that, well, Orange Man is bad or something like that. And I guess that justifies all of it. Although we'll see. Don't be surprised either if Mark Carney in 2 seconds starts announcing, okay, we're deploying the Canadian military. Sorry, Trump called me. He threatened to do stuff. So I don't know. But anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on this for now in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.